Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Walker, and this is From the Heart. One of the most asked questions among some political leaders and some religious leaders is whether America can ever heal. Out of this chaos and division that we're going through now, can this country reclaim its peace? Well, one person who knows a lot about the pursuit of peace is our special guest today. Reverend Jeffrey Brown, a nationally recognized leader in urban violence reduction and coalition building, founder of the Boston 10-Point Coalition that helped orchestrate a dramatic decline in violence in Boston, earning the city the title in 2024, the safest big city in the country. His development business, My City at Peace, works to revitalize distressed neighborhoods. He is the associate pastor of Boston's historic 12th Baptist Church and remains in my heart always because together we co-founded the creation of Embrace Boston, a breathtaking memorial to Martin and Coretta King, a stunning testament to love. So I had to have Reverend Brown on this show. And I don't know, welcome, Jeff. I don't know if it's fair to talk about community violence and the violent kind of atmosphere that we now have in this country. Is that even a fair comparison as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when we talk about the things we need to do to have peace in our nation, violence, whether it comes from the community or whether it comes from politics or whether it comes from government, will always disturb the efforts of people to build community. And so, yeah, I think there's a connection there. And I think it's appropriate to talk about it.
Well, I want to get to some specific questions about what's going on in violence right now. But let's back up a little bit and talk about your background, because you were a part of a group of clergy that kind of put Boston on a whole different level of handling violence in the communities. Tell us about the 10-Point Coalition. And I know this has been a while, but we need to learn from the past. That's how we move forward. Tell us about the creation there and what you guys did.
Way back in the late 80s and the early 90s, the Jurassic era, for someone like me, crack cocaine was really, and cocaine in general was really ravaging the nation, but particularly crack cocaine in Black communities. And somewhere around mid to late 80s, you start to see the dramatic rise in youth homicides. And at that time, I was a young pastor, in the Boston area, and started to do funerals of teenagers. And, when I went to seminary, of course, we got the training around, how to deal with funerals. But it was generally for somebody who's older, who's lived a life. But when you're doing a funeral of a 16-year-old or an 11-year-old, it's really tough. And in some of the circumstances, which were, through acts of violence and someone getting shot and killed, there are always these young people, young men generally, who are sitting in the balcony of my church just waiting for things to get done so that they can go back out and continue the deed. At that time, Rev, no one seemed to know how to deal with it other than incarceration.
Right.
And so we had the police department who was trying to arrest as many people as they could. And they thought that would be the solution. But for those of us who lived in the community and who had children in the community, that was not an acceptable answer. Right. And so there were a few of us, who sort of came together at the wake of a tragic affair that happened in a church during a funeral, Morning Star Baptist Church. And we came together to try to figure out a solution. And the only thing that we could think of was to come together and to walk together and to find out what was happening on the streets when the youth were there. And so we started walking the streets at night. between 10 o'clock at night, sometimes 2, 3 in the morning, trying to understand what we weren't able to understand, conventionally. And so being able to build relationships with youth on the streets, the ones who were causing the violence, helped us to understand exactly what was going on and what we needed to do in order to reduce the violence in our communities.
It was an amazing moment in Boston history, and it worked, right? I mean, eventually you did affect the numbers of violent crimes, as you said, but it took a lot of different people to
Yeah.
participate in it, right?
Absolutely. I think the value that we brought as faith leaders is that we could be the glue, if you will, and the convener of disparate parts of law enforcement and the sort of work of trying to do violence in communities and, have everybody sort of come together and work together. So we worked with members of the Boston Police Department. We worked with the probation departments of the various courts and the judges. We worked with community associations who were getting money, for violence reduction projects, but the youth themselves who really needed it weren't getting into those programs. So we were able to usher youth into those programs. And the city itself, in terms of summer jobs, for example, when we go to high school kids who are doing very well, we convinced the mayor, look, if you give us jobs for some of these kids who are struggling, but they're not trying to, be, the violent person that they were, they're trying to do something different. We could get them to, choose life as a different option than choosing death. And so they were able to, through all of that, see a 79% reduction of violent crime over a 8-year period. And then we had a 2.5-year period in which we had 0 juvenile homicides.
Wow.
Which was amazing because at the beginning of all of that in the 90s, in the early 90s, most of those crimes were being done by juveniles. They were either juveniles who were shooting or juveniles who were getting shot and killed.
Mm-hmm.
So,
has any of that held? Because that's a long time ago. Boston has been through a lot of different changes,
absolutely.
but recent numbers are across the board, I hear, of violent crime are down. Is that
Yeah.
true?
What people need to understand is that before we started doing this work, people weren't talking about we're going to reduce crime. They were talking about we have to figure out ways to cope with crime because it's here to stay, or violence because it's here to stay. After we did what we did, people saw the value of the collaborative way of doing violence reduction. So, police realized that they couldn't arrest themselves out of this situation. Judges realized they couldn't jail enough people, in order to affect it, that it really required the community to be able to rise and to get involved and to be seen as partners in the effort. And so, in what has been amazing about Boston is that to this day, we still enjoy some of the lowest homicide rates that we've had in decades. And part of the reason is because we understand the value of collaboration. And that's happened across the country. I mean, I've been to hundreds of cities, working with mayors or city managers, working with faith groups and law enforcement departments, sort of teaching them that way of coming together and valuing the community aspect of this. Because absent that, all you have is a containment policy that tries to keep violence in certain neighborhoods. If you have that, then you have a way in which the entire city can begin that process of healing.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea, though, that it takes collaboration. It takes people working with each other. So am I naive, or what could you say you could transfer from that kind of work, community violence? What could be transferred to where we are now in just this kind of violent atmosphere that we have in the country, or an atmosphere of fear. What do you think?
Yeah. I think what I have witnessed in all of what's been experienced in our country is folks who are sort of sticking hard with an ideology of personhood that, of course, includes their people but excludes others.
Mhm.
And as long as we operate on a way of life that values othering people, then we will be headed for this, cliff
Yeah.
of this abyss that, precedes, all of this violence that we're experiencing today.
Yeah.
So I think that, it really starts with being able to value people from where they are as human beings, and that they are loved by God up above
Hmm.
in the same way that you are.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
being able to start at that part and to sort of look at the two great commandments, love the Lord your God for all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. I think starting there is where we need to get to at this point. I mean, right now, it's just all,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Especially, excuse me, I didn't mean to stop to talk on top of you, but especially since a lot of where we are has to do with religious differences. I mean,
yeah,
there's ideology here that's behind some of this. There's us and them, right?
yeah, yeah,
But the church plays a role in where we are right now. From January 6th, when I'll never forget the sight of seeing crosses and Trump signs and crosses, and at January 6th when all hell broke loose in the
yeah,
nation's capital. So, but okay, so we know the church is a part of this.
yeah,
There's two different ways the church seems to be going, if at
yeah.
least two different ways. How do we try to? Is it possible to bring? Who plays the role in bringing this all back together? I think it's the
Yeah.
church. What do you
Yeah.
think?
No, I think the church can play a role, but right now the church seems to be horribly divided. You have um, this muscular brand of Christian nationalism that
Right.
people are seem to be embracing very hard, and much of that is aided by, frankly, the evangelical church in America in its various manifestations. And and it's kind of hard for the church to be a part of the solution when they're enabling the problem. And so when you've got evangelical ministers who are actually saying to folks that, Black church theology and Black church practice is not really Christian practice, and they need to sort of become more like us in order to, be right with God, you're going to have a continuing problem. And so, we've got to, we can be a big part of the solution, but we're going to have to learn what the real tenets of Christianity are that sort of spans race, that sort of spans, all of the different divisions that we have in our country.
And that seems to me, I agree with you, but that's a tough one. People say, no, my way is the way. The
Yeah,
Christian nationalists say that, the
yeah,
progressives say that. So how do we even begin to gauge? Then you have something like what happened in Minneapolis, which I thought was just extraordinary on so many levels.
yeah,
And the church played a very, very powerful role in the resistance.
absolutely.
So it's almost like the church is battling itself.
Yeah, yeah, you can see it happening, especially in Minneapolis. And if you think about Minneapolis, we've had sort of several manifestations of that, right? So George Floyd in 2020, happened in that area, and then these two tragic deaths that occurred. The church had played a seminal role in organizing around that. But let me also argue on the other side, if you think about January 6th, just like you mentioned earlier, the church had a big role in that as well. So it really is a tool that can be used to bring everybody together, but it also can be a tool that can do the opposite. And so we have to sort of figure out a way. And, I mean, Liz, you're a fantastic preacher. You could figure it out somehow. So
If I can figure it out, anybody can figure it out. Think about a text. And I shouldn't even bring this up because I won't be able to tell you where it is, but you're a Bible scholar. You will. Uh,
oh,
will you divide up Jesus? That's the text. Do you ever remember hearing this? I don't know who's speaking, but
mhm.
I can try to look, and I want to say it's Paul.
It
Uh,
could be, it
but
could be Paul. You're probably talking about uh First Corinthians when,
Go ahead.
yeah, I, I'm just thinking when Paul was talking about um, the division that was occurring because people were taking sides in terms of apostles, right? Someone was a Peter, someone was a
Right.
Paul, someone was a, and we all need to be of Jesus. I think
Right.
that's where you were going with that. But
And
I'm getting old, so I'm not quite where it is. It's somewhere in
that's
Corinthians.
all right. At least I got it from the Bible. I'm getting old too, so I mean making stuff up. But the idea of kind of deciding what you want Jesus to be for you, as opposed to what at
Yeah.
least I believe it was the biggest message that Jesus brought to earth. But I think that, and I'm going to ask you, I think that the only way this division is going to end is through a spirit. I don't see it resolved in an economic way. I don't see it resolved in a political way. What about you? How do you see an end to this where we are now?
Well, I mean, it's going to be an end one way or another.
That's true.
We're just going to have to decide, you know, what kind of people do we really want to be? And I think that's where that spiritual piece comes from. It
Right.
really it really starts with relationship. I mean, the one thing that I learned in the streets that has always stuck with me is that once you enter into relationship with someone, you begin to see them differently. And then you yourself will also change because your point of view about that person's situation changes. Folks would have stereotypes, for example, of, a gang member or a drug dealer, not knowing their background, not knowing their family situation, not knowing the conditions of the city that helped to build the atmosphere that caused all the violence. But once you start getting into that work, you see it from a completely different point of view. And I think with this rancor that's happening, between folks, between all of the ideological lines. I think the way that begins to break down is by, being in relationship with one another or starting that. And best way to do it is to do it, not, sort of directly intentionally, but you build a project together. For us, it was like we went out in the streets and we're like, look, our aim is to reduce the homicide rate. We want you to judge us on that. And in order for us to do that with you all have to agree with us to do that. So what can we do together?
Mm-hmm.
Try to make that work. And in doing that work together, we started to get to know one another. And then we started to understand each other's point of view. And I think that was the key link in building the kinds of programming that was needed to get folks to avoid, that kind of lifestyle.
And that's possible, you believe, on another level, on a national level, on a neighborhood level.
I think on a national level, I mean, people like will talk about, the current president and how he uses race as a power tool, and how he uses differences as a power dynamic to gain more power. And, those things really should be able to grow and flourish within relationship, right? This whole current thing about erasing history, right? History is a is a tool. It's a conversation between the past and the present for the future. I believe that's what John Meekum said about it.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and if we look at it in that way, then you can't use history, as an art or as a power tool. It has to be a science, right? Where
Right.
we'll research and understand. And the mistakes that we've made in our country need to be understood, not erased or ignored. We need to understand them so that we don't make them again.
Absolutely. I think there's a quote, those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it.
Read it. Yes, absolutely.
Our story, that's what's going on around here. Um, what what gives you optimism, or does anything give you optimism right now in this particular political moment?
There are young leaders across the country who are looking at what's happening and they are refusing to give up. And it's those young people, that give me hope. Many of them, I know they're ministers, in their various communities in Washington, D.C., and Oakland, California, and, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and in a variety of places. And they are determined to figure out a way to turn all of this around.
Mhm.
They are protecting their congregations, helping them to understand the context of all of this that we're dealing with politically, what the origins of it are, but not in such a way where they're closed-minded to folks who would be different from them, but could share that same, thrust of looking for community and looking for peace. And so, I see it all over the place. There's some older people too, but I'm really encouraged by these young people and how they are rising. I'm an associate pastor of the historic 12th Baptist Church in Boston. And as you know, that was the place where Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, attended and when they were in school. But the pastor of that church is a young man. His name is Willie Bodrick. And he's been doing just an amazing job,
Amazing.
And his hopefulness about where we can go as a country is really inspiring. And so I think that there are thousands of younger people who are looking at what's happening and they're saying, we need to be in a different place. And I want to help lead to do that. So that's what gives me hope.
And they're doing it, and it gives us all hope. I didn't want to end this conversation without talking about the impact of public art. And you and I worked very hard over many years to get the King Memorial embraced
Yep.
in Boston. What's the significant, and for those of you, I know everybody in Boston knows this, but this podcast is seen by a few people here in Florida. For those of you who don't know, this is a memorial to love, which I
Yep.
think is, you don't see that every day. So
Yep.
what do you think, Pastor Jeff, that the impact of this Boston embrace could be for the very topic we're talking about?
Yeah. Well, the Embrace Monument, if you recall, was the moment that Dr. King just found out that he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he embraced his wife, Coretta, and that is what is memorialized in that in that monument. And so for me, I have seen that monument sort of stand out as a beacon of hope and as a beacon of community, within Boston. There are folks who, sort of come together During protests, they gather around that. There are people who visit in order to get inspiration and reflections, from that, and then they write about it and try to get more people to be inspired by it. It's everything, Liz, that we had hoped that this
Yeah.
piece of public art would do.
Yeah.
Uh, what was so important to me about it is that it was the first time a piece of public art that really was representative of people of color was placed on Boston Common, which is the oldest park in the United States. And so, we have what we commonly call the Massachusetts 54th Monument, but that's really the Robert Gould Shaw Monument. So it was really a monument built by his father to commemorate, his work. But it sort of lets me know that Boston as a city, has been changing and has been evolving and has been getting into the art of what it means to build community, because you're starting to see, the strength of the diversity of the city, begin to rise. And so, thank God, for Paul English and for you, and how we were able to push this very important message to the point where the city finally began to believe in it, and so they supported it, and we were able to get the money and to put it on there. I think everything begins and ends with love. As James Baldwin had said. I mean, for us, it's about loving yourself and loving your neighbor, and loving whatever higher power that you embrace. The more that we have symbols to remind us of that, and not to remind us of the divisions that we've had in our country or the hatred that we've had in our country, I think the better off we'll be.
I absolutely agree with you. Every time I see that memorial, I think about all the hard work that went into getting it up, and that it was not easy. I mean, we
But
worked
neither,
hard all the way. But the other thing that gives me hope about that memorial and what it stands for is it reminds us that this is a continuum. The
yeah,
struggle for freedom, the struggle for justice,
yeah,
the work of love. It's not just one-off thing.
that's
And we're
right.
still, we're still fighting the same fight that King was fighting in some ways
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Uh, uh,
If you remember that on the monument there is a quote from Coretta Scott King, and she says, essentially she said every generation has to have this moment, and they have to choose to rise together, in this moment. And there are younger people who are seeing this, and they are rising, like we've risen in our time, and our parents rose in their time. But it's what makes this country great, in my opinion, that you have, folks who not only celebrate the diversity that we have, but we also fight for it.
yeah.
And we just need to continue to encourage folks to keep fighting until we achieve, what those founding fathers really hope to happen, I believe,
Yes.
rather than what other folks have claimed them to do. I really think they were trying to look beyond even themselves as they created this country called the United States. And so I embrace that futuristic vision.
I embrace that along with you. I am always lifted when I talk to you, Reverend Brown. Thank you so much for joining me and seeing
Yeah.
the connections that are made all over this world, and trying to get to that mountaintop and get on the other side. Right? We're all on that effort. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining us today. And peace
You're
is possible.
welcome. I
Peace
know it's possible.
is
It's
possible.
possible. We're going
Absolutely.
to keep moving.
Keep
Yes.
moving. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you next time on From the Heart.